Welcome to another Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness Scholar Talk. I'm Tony Williams with the Bill of Rights Institute, Senior Fellow there. And we are very honored to have Stephanie Hinnershitz here with us to discuss the piece she wrote on the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and immigration in the late 19th century. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, I'll introduce you, if you don't mind. Dr. Stephanie Hinnershitz is an assistant professor of history at Cleveland State University. She's the author of Race, Religion, and Civil Rights, Asian Students on the West Coast from 1900 to 1968. And more recently, A Different Shade of Justice, Asian American Civil Rights in the South. And I understand that you have a forthcoming book on Japanese American incarceration during World War II.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, again, thank you for your contribution to the Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness textbook and to joining us today.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's jump right in. And I was wondering if maybe you can help provide the teachers and students with some historical context for Chinese immigration to the United States in the late 19th century. What compelled them to leave China, or what compelled them to come to the United States?
One of the things that I use when I'm teaching to help students understand why immigrants leave their home countries and why they come to the United States, it's this idea of push and pull factors. Okay. So there's a reason why they choose, or maybe they feel like they don't have much of a choice and that they have to go for economic or political or cultural reasons. But for the Chinese, during the mid to late 19th century, there's a lot of political upheaval. There are the Opium Wars with Britain. There's environmental disasters, droughts, floods. There's rebellions. There's a lot of events that are going on that are making Chinese, especially farmers, men who are not incredibly wealthy. Maybe they're just trying to get by, but they start to lose access to their livelihood. And so the push factors are political, economic. They're feeling like they can't really provide for themselves or their families. So they're looking for some place to go. So the push is, there are forces that are kind of pushing them out. And then the pull factor, it's actually pretty global. So there are other places that Chinese could choose to go and did go. So one of the big industries that will draw them away from China is mining. And so mining is certainly important, becoming important in the United States by the late 19th century, but it's also becoming very large in Australia, in South America. So there's a lot of Chinese who do actually go to those places, and they start to come to the United States in larger numbers in the 1850s as part of the gold rush. So just like with a lot of other people within the United States that are moving out to the West to try and make their fortune, or maybe just get a little bit of extra money, the Chinese are doing that as well. So there's this idea of looking at the US as Gold Mountain. That's what Chinese men refer to it as. They're going to go make their money on Gold Mountain, send money home, and then eventually they're going to want to return home back to their families. And then they also, not just mining, but when they come and settle in places like California and other places out in the West, there are these little towns that pop up around the mining claims, and the Chinese find an economic spot to get into doing jobs like cooking and laundry that a lot of the other miners didn't necessarily want to do. So there's a lot of push and pull that's going on, and they are part of a larger movement of migrants to the United States from other places around the world.
Right, and the railroad?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so once the claims to the mines start to kind of dry up, and that doesn't pan out exactly as a lot of individuals would have hoped, then the next sort of wave of industry out west in the 19th century would be the railroads. So especially the Transcontinental Railroad. That's also where you're going to see a lot of competition for jobs between Chinese employer or Chinese employees and white laborers. So it's like the Chinese kind of moved from mining into doing the labor on the railroads. They do accept lower wages than some of the white laborers do, and that's because they left China to come here, so they're intent on making some extra money. And there's also this sort of stereotype among bosses that Chinese men are preferable to white laborers because the white laborers they get drunk a lot, they roughhouse, they're not disciplined, and so that creates some friction between Chinese and white laborers. But yeah, Chinese come to the United States when at a time when the United States is industrializing and also expanding. Yeah.
Right. And this is part of a much larger movement of peoples around the world and to the United States. Can you just talk a little bit maybe about that general immigration picture during the late 19th, early 20th century?
Yeah, definitely. So, and this is another good example of using that framework of push and pull if you're teaching, because you can kind of move it and apply it to a lot of different groups. And a lot of historians look at migration during this time, late 19th, early 20th century, and they trace it to this massive industrialization that's happening, a lot of expansion among different businesses and corporations in the United States. That time period, around the Gilded Age, early 20th century, up until that point is going to be the largest influx of migrants to the United States and also the most varied. So that's another really key about this time period in American immigration history, because you will see people from different nations arrive in larger numbers than America has ever seen before. So especially when employers are looking for laborers, there's the idea that America is this land of opportunity compared to political crises in China, political crises in Europe, a lot of upheaval going on over there, people fleeing persecution for their religious beliefs, cultural beliefs and practices. So yeah, it's massive. It's just this massive wave of migration that's coming to the United States because of economic and political forces as well. Yeah.
Right. And, Europe had a lot of American recruiters going over and trying to draw the immigrants for their cheap labor and so forth. Was there anything like that going on in, like, let's say, Chinese port cities or?
Yeah, there was. So something very similar, so kind of the similar mechanism where there were recruiters who would be in China. More often there would be recruiters kind of at the ports like San Francisco, other places when Chinese arrived here to the United States. So sometimes it would be kind of word of mouth. If someone heard from someone over in the United States, you come here, you'll get a job, and there would be recruiters from mining companies, other corporations who would be there, ready and willing to enlist Chinese to come work for them. And especially after the Civil War in the South, there's a unique time period where former plantation owners, who are now just planters, right? They're not necessarily plantation owners, but they're just planters. But they're looking for another form of cheap labor to take the place of slaves. And so they think they can get that from the Chinese. And so there's a lot of recruiters who go out west in San Francisco and even bring Chinese down to places like Mississippi, even into Alabama a little bit. So that's part of this story as well. So there's a big drive to try and recruit and bring Chinese to a lot of different places.
Okay, very, very interesting. I'm learning a lot already. So you've alluded to this a little bit already, but so where did the Chinese immigrants in America, where did they settle more specifically, and why would they settle there?
Mm-hmm. So with this wave, during the mid to late 19th century, it was predominantly in the West, predominantly in California, not just the cities, but a lot of these little towns that would pop up around mining claims, other little towns along the railroad. So really, California was kind of this hot spot for Chinese settlement. San Francisco at first, Los Angeles during the late 19th century was kind of like this little backwater town. So the Chinatown was not not anything like what San Francisco was even by the 1870s or 1880s, but it was starting to grow. Places in Wyoming, up in Washington State, they kind of stick along the West Coast, and they stick to where those industries like mining and railroad construction, where they were at, they would hang out around there. And then in the South too, and there were Chinese who, you know, ended up on the East Coast in New York City. A lot of those communities had been around before this more recent wave. So like Chinese merchants, they might have been along the East Coast before, but for this specific wave, it's predominantly in the West, or at least like in the Rockies area. So they fit into this story of migration, but also American settlement in the West. So they're definitely part of that narrative too.
Okay, excellent. And you know, a lot of xenophobia, a lot of nativism towards immigrants of all kinds
Yes.
in
Yeah.
the late 19th century. And so can you maybe specifically talk about why there may have been hostility towards the Chinese specifically and their immigration to the country?
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting because the sharp turn against Chinese immigrants, especially Chinese working class men, who that's the majority of who are coming here. Very few women. It's overwhelmingly male. It happens quickly. Like it's kind of this sharp turn where, for the most part, generalizing is kind of never good, but it makes sense in this case. For the most part, when Chinese men came to the United States to work, they were filling a labor gap. So there was a need for them to come here because, you know, not many people were doing those same types of jobs. So when a Chinese man came to mine, and let's say, you know, he didn't exactly find what he wanted, but he was willing to do the laundry and cook the food for others in the mining town. Okay, right? There's no competition there. There's no worry that a Chinese worker is going to take someone else's job. By the time you get to the 1870s, though, and you see that shift away from mining to railroad construction, there's economic competition. And that's when things are really going to start to change in terms of the perception of Chinese immigrants. So what I would say is what began as maybe, you know, at best, this ambivalence toward Chinese immigrants. A lot of white Americans looked at them as they were, you know, quote, strange or different or just completely unable to like assimilate to American culture, but almost like this kind of curiosity with them. By the 1870s, that starts to take a sharp turn, and you start to see a lot of the xenophobia come out of economic competition, which is, that's part of like immigration history in America in general. There's a lot of economic basis for that. So as soon as you get more white men competing for those railroad jobs with the Chinese, then all of a sudden the Chinese aren't just kind of, quote, these oddities. Now they're real threats, and they're threats to livelihood. They're perceived threats to like American, what it means to be an American man. You know, you're working, you're supposed to be providing for your family. And there's a growing movement among nativists who claim to be speaking for, you know, who's looking out for the white male worker. There's a lot of politicians who can get their start on that and say, I am, because you have to compete with the Chinese. There's also economic downturns in the late 19th century, in the 1870s, panics, things of that nature. So yeah, economic times get more difficult. There's more competition. And then you start to see some of the more violent outpourings of xenophobia. So it's pretty quick, you know, when we go from being like, oh, all right, you know, the Chinese are here, but they're filling a labor need, to now all of a sudden they're competition. And then it touches on every other aspect of Chinese culture. Then the xenophobia starts to really, really pick up and manifest in some pretty nasty ways.
Right. And on the American side, that leads me to my next discussion. what particular groups may have been for or against immigration, Chinese immigration? I think a lot of students may be surprised at some of the answers, but just in terms of maybe the political parties or labor and business and just different groups in American society, who was for and against?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that I think that's happening now and more recently in what historians are writing about this time period is we're starting to get a much more nuanced and complex understanding of Chinese exclusion and who was for or against it. It's one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about immigration history in general, because sometimes you end up with these really strange bedfellows where you have people who you think, wait a minute, based on everything that this party claims to be, or based on everything that otherwise would make me think that you feel this way about the Chinese, that's not what's actually happening. So it's the Chinese Migration and Chinese Exclusion Act is an interesting way to see this play out. And there's a couple different ways to approach this. A traditional way that historians had looked at it, and it's not entirely, it's not incorrect, we've just kind of added some more layers to it, is the regional difference. So the regional difference between where the majority of Chinese settled, which would be on the West Coast, and where, you know, there were Chinese communities, but they weren't around some of the same economic problems that they were in the West. So there's like this regional divide among white working class men and labor unions in the West who saw them as a direct threat versus people on the East Coast who, again, certainly not saying that they weren't prejudiced or didn't have weird, very kind of racist stereotypes of the Chinese, right, but there might not have been a huge outpouring of anti-Chinese sentiment. So there's this regional divide between people. In the South, for example, so in the South, you have these Southern planters who, you know, knowing everything that we know about Southern planters who were once plantation owners, by all accounts, you know, rather racist individuals, there might be an inclination to say, oh, well, they would be opposed to Chinese immigration. Not necessarily. Wide range of, or a spectrum of beliefs there. So you certainly did have Southerners, Southern politicians who didn't want Chinese migrating to the United States because eventually they would make their way to the South. And there are some politicians who express in Congress saying, we don't need, quote, you know, another race problem. We've got enough of our own. We don't need one more group. But then on the other hand, you've got corporations, you've got corporations who want to build railroads in the South. You have planters who they are not initially opposed to Chinese migration because they fulfill an economic need. In Ohio, for example, too, I mean, the Chinese population in Ohio in like the 1870s and 1880s is minuscule. But farmers who otherwise might not be that interested in immigration, they really don't see much of a problem with Chinese immigrants because they fulfill different labor needs. Merchants. So merchants on the East Coast, some of these traders who've been around for a while, businessmen, they don't necessarily want Chinese restriction because they want to keep the trade channels with China open. So they're pushing and saying, let's not be too hasty about this because we don't want to make China angry and then limit any kind of opportunities for trade that we might have. Politicians, including some kind of, you know, high-ranking ones, Chester Arthur, before he does eventually sign the Chinese Exclusion Act, he will veto the first round of it, and he, again, for diplomatic reasons, doesn't want to do anything that would make you know, the Chinese government angry. But if you're looking at more kind of working class groups, white working class groups, there, especially in the West, there's going to be a push for restriction and then eventually exclusion because they are an economic threat. And that's this kind of rallying cry for people on the West Coast all the way up to 1924, where unions, different nativist groups, they'll argue that who's looking out for them? You know, like these wealthy elitists in Washington, D.C., they don't know what it's like to be a white working class man on the West Coast competing for jobs with the Chinese. No one's looking out for us. And then that's when states start to pass their own anti-Chinese and eventually anti-Japanese laws. They're kind of taking it upon themselves. African Americans are another really interesting group with Chinese migration, also kind of spanning a spectrum there. There was a source that a friend had shown me years ago. I think it was an African American preacher from one of the southern states, but he kind of wrote this sermon that was anti-Chinese immigration, and his argument was they're quote heathens, right? They're not Christian. They're never going to be Christian. They have backwards habits. They gamble. They engage in prostitution. They smoke opium. So kind of this backlash there. And then you had other African Americans who felt the same way about they didn't want to compete with Chinese laborers. After all, I mean, they just kind of fought to get out of slavery, and now they don't even have a fair shot, with their economic livelihood. And then you had others who were very pro Chinese migration for a lot of different reasons. So it's messy, right? It's very complicated, and that might be somewhat confusing, but I think it's interesting to even have maybe students, really kind of hone in and look at these groups and how they kind of challenge preconceived notions of kind of taking what we know about immigration today, party affiliation, whatnot, and kind of like what happens when you transfer that back to the 19th century. And it doesn't necessarily look the same, right? I mean, it's one of the interesting things about studying history. You can't do that. It's very difficult to do that. So there were a lot of, on the West Coast, and the changes between the Democratic Party of today and the Democratic Party of yesteryear, in the 19th century, a lot of powerful politicians on the West Coast were Democrats, and they spoke for their white working class constituents. And sometimes it was the politicians who spoke, the most aggressively against Chinese migration, because they could kind of rally up their base a little bit and get votes that way. So very complicated.
Very complicated, but you delineated everything very well, and just endlessly fascinating. I mean, really, really interesting picture you painted there. And can you provide some of those examples? Were there particularly egregious examples of discriminatory practices or examples of violence even against Chinese immigrants during this time?
Yeah, so I'm kind of challenge myself a little bit with what I said earlier. So yeah, I mean, Chinese, when they did come here, they were filling an economic need, and people were kind of ambivalent about them, about Chinese as a wave of migration. But almost from day one, there were acts that were discriminatory, and that they singled out Chinese immigrants and held them to a certain set of laws and rules that they did not hold other groups to. So there was the earliest example is a tax, a foreign minors tax in places like California, where if you were a minor and you were foreign born, you had to pay a higher tax. That specifically meant Chinese. I mean, like, even if it didn't exactly say that, that's, by that point, the Chinese were the largest minority mining group at that time. State of California raised a lot of revenue from foreign miners. The Chinese were, they paid it because they expected that they would make it kind of big eventually. Many did not, but a lot of revenue there that came from discriminatory taxes. You have in the West, before you see any kind of stable or sophisticated police presence, so before there was any kind of, really working or efficient law presence, a lot of towns, cities, communities had things called public enemy lists, where they would be different acts that could be considered illegal, or if you did those things, you were a public enemy. And then there might be vigilante justice against that, but it was a way to kind of order things. So a lot of these public enemy lists, when you get to like the 1870s, many of those acts, or many of the things that are considered harmful to the community, specifically mention Chinese or Asiatics or Mongolian immigrants. So if you are a white individual who teaches a Chinese person how to read or write English, you could be put on a public enemy list because you're assisting the Chinese to maybe get a leg up when it comes to economic competition. There's even laws like in Rancho Chico, California. That's just one I know off the top of my head because I use it a lot in teaching, where there was if you are an employer and you hired a Chinese employee even above an African-American man, you were a public enemy. So there it gets even more complicated where, they're kind of favoring even African-Americans before the Chinese. So those are pretty discriminatory. There are going to be nationwide acts passed against Chinese women being able to come to the United States. The belief there that any Chinese woman, if she's here because the population is overwhelmingly male, then she has to be a prostitute. That was the argument. And so there's very few Chinese women in the United States in the late 19th century. There were those who were prostitutes because they were maybe tricked or trafficked to come over to the US and they end up doing something that they don't want to do. But that's another form of discrimination. And then as those laws become more common and nativism starts to increase, when you get to the 1870s and then especially the 1880s, right before Chinese exclusion, that's when you start to see a lot of violence. So that's where you start to see a lot of nativist groups or even just kind of mobs start to get frustrated because they feel like no one is listening to them. And so they take matters into their own hands and either, with the assistance of the local law enforcement or, the local law enforcers kind of look the other way. There are these massive demonstrations of violence against the Chinese. One of the largest examples of a public lynching in American history happens in 1871 in Los Angeles, where there's a dispute between two Chinese men in Los Angeles' really small Chinatown. Guns are drawn. There ends up being a white farmer, I believe, who gets killed in the act. And, I think a police officer gets killed too or gets injured. And so this creates this idea that the Chinese are out of control and they need to be taught a lesson. So there's this massive, interracial, interethnic mob of people who round up all the people in Chinatown, lynch 18 Chinese men, and then basically burn Los Angeles' Chinatown down and push them away. And not much comes of it. The only kind of victories that the Chinese can get for their suffering is they're able to file property suits, which sometimes Chinese actually have. That's the most successful avenue they take. If they might not get justice for physical damage or injury, but they do have a pretty successful record in the late 1800s of filing for property damages, which is also interesting. And then another big example of violence, this happens after Chinese exclusion, but it is the 1880s in Tacoma, Washington. There is a massive, it's similar to Los Angeles, but a massive act of violence against the Chinese community where, businesses attacked, people attacked, and then eventually all Chinese just run out. And there's never any justice done. No one is ever really held responsible. And that sets a standard for other towns and communities in the West that they can do the same thing. They can run out the Chinese and they're not going to be held responsible for it. And that idea that you can take that kind of violent measure against the Chinese becomes so common that it becomes known as the Tacoma method, because if it can happen in Tacoma, it can happen anywhere. And so that's sort of the buildup to exclusion, and it continues to happen even after exclusion. So it gets very violent. You go from seeing these kind of racist caricatures of Chinese in political cartoons, which it's kind of easy maybe for some people to look at that and say, oh, that's terrible, but it's a political cartoon, right? I mean, it's not actually hurting anyone. The end result is it does, right? Because it does, these stereotypes of the Chinese as completely other and they can't assimilate. That's what lays the groundwork for people to treat the Chinese as they're not human, right? They can kind of treat them however they want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that information will surprise students, especially since we normally associate lynching, and maybe properly so, with African Americans, but it happened to other groups as well.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, some really untold stories. So thank you for sharing those, because we probably don't know a lot about them. You don't really read many of those in textbooks. So that's great to have the story behind the story. So. Okay, so let's start to talk about the movement towards exclusion, this Exclusion Act. And so what particular arguments are made, maybe I guess at the state or national level, for advocating Chinese exclusion? And if I'm not mistaken, you write in your essay that some people, such as Frederick Douglass, whom students have heard of from reading our other essays in the textbook, they did speak courageously against it. So what are these forces involved in exclusion?
Mm-hmm. So you have, in a really kind of interesting way, the violence that's taking place in the West against the Chinese, for a lot of people elsewhere and a lot of politicians elsewhere across the country, they're going to use that as an example for why Chinese migration should be restricted and then eventually excluded. And their argument is, look at what's happening, right? There's this level of violence, and it's out of control. And sort of who's to blame for this? Well, it might not necessarily be the people who are doing the violent acts. So the rational thing to do is to limit or exclude Chinese immigrants. So it's this. It's very weird, but it starts to be this idea of how the Chinese, if they're not violent themselves, because of the kind of landscape of America and where we're at, they bring violence with them through their interactions. There's also people who are going to take some of the stereotypes of Chinese as criminals. They're doing illegal things, gambling, prostitution, drugs, and say they're a criminal element. So, there's proof that these individuals engage in these behaviors. What they don't say is that, well, there's plenty of white people who also go to Chinatown to do the same things, and gladly give them their business. But again, the argument is that, well, that wouldn't be there without the Chinese. There's the economic argument starts to become much more powerful, that there is a level of economic competition there. And if corporations can't look out for white employees, if corporations are perhaps greedy and they're looking for, they're looking out for the bottom line and how to make a quick buck, then maybe we should exclude Chinese laborers from coming to the United States. So there's just like, the different groups of who are for or against Chinese exclusion, the reasons for exclusion are very varied. And sometimes they run, this kind of, we're only looking out for the best interests of the Chinese. If they come here and they get attacked by white people, maybe they shouldn't come here, to no, they're becoming more of an economic threat. And the economic threat element of this, I would say, plays a pretty important part, because that's a big part of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's not all Chinese, it's Chinese laborers. Now, all that being said, you do have people who are speaking out against exclusion, and as you work eventually kind of toward that. And Frederick Douglass is a really good example. I would say he's a good example because for all of maybe like the wishy-washy sentiments of people for why they might be opposed to exclusion, you don't want to let the white mob win this one. If you kind of give in and cave, then what are we doing here? But he has a very kind of, forward-thinking explanation for why Chinese exclusion is bad. So he gives, writes about what he calls a composite nation, and how America is America because it is a land of many different people who bring many different gifts. And that's what makes America an economic powerhouse, right? You can't turn away these individual groups when they have done so much. And so he compares like the Chinese with the Germans, and he's like, they're kind of the same idea. They might be different, but they offer something. But then he takes it one step further, and he specifically mentions, and this is in the 1800s, he specifically mentions human rights, which I think is incredibly radical, right, for the time, like talking about human rights. And he starts to bring up this idea that no matter what you might think about the Chinese, and he has this like paragraph in this composite nation speech where he even says, he's like, all right, if you're a white person, maybe I could see how as a white person, you control everything. You're worried about Chinese coming here and upsetting things. Fine, right? I don't agree with you, but okay, I'll hear your argument. He counters that by saying, well, one of the things that all humans hold very dear is this idea of what he calls locomotion, right? Your ability to move, the freedom of movement, the freedom where, if you're someone on the East Coast and you want a better life, it's your right to be able to pick up and move out west, being a pioneer. And he's basically saying that's a human right. It's not something that just belongs to white people. It's not even something that just belongs to Americans. The human right to be able to move and to seek a better life, that's for him at the core of why Chinese exclusion is, really, he would say against human rights, but unconstitutional. It's severely limiting on the liberties that we have as Americans. So that's a great primary source to use. It kind of stands apart, I would say, from some of the other arguments and just how reasoned and kind of forward thinking it is. But yeah, it's the economic competition element of this that it's reflected in the act itself, and there's kind of no way of getting around that.
Right. Well, thank you for speaking about Douglas so much. He appears frequently in our book and standing for those constitutional principles, right? And justice and equality of all people. So he was doing it in ways that we maybe normally don't even think of.
Right. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so maybe you can tell students what the Chinese Exclusionary Act, what did it specifically do?
So being a product of economic anxiety, and again, I would consistently remind students that this is not a very stable economic time in America. Right. Even though you've got the Rockefellers and the Carnegie, right, and the Vanderbilts, they're racking up their money at this time, and there are certainly a lot of Americans moving up into the middle class. It's not very stable. There are panics. There are, what we call today like recessions, these kind of cycles. So there is a lot of economic anxiety here, which feeds into the Exclusion Act. And what it does is it doesn't technically exclude all Chinese. It focuses especially on laborers, manual labor. So these would be the people who would directly compete with Americans for the types of jobs which are more prevalent at the time, which would be manual laboring jobs, manufacturing, different things of that nature. So if you are, there's some excluded groups from the Exclusion Act. If you're a diplomat, a religious official, and there were plenty of Chinese who were Christians who came to the United States. If you were a student, if you were a merchant, you could come to the United States because you're not competing. You're not directly competing with the vast majority of Americans at the time. It was still difficult. You still had to get special written documents from the Chinese government proving that you weren't a manual laborer, which is still a little bit difficult. But this excludes Chinese laborers from coming to the United States. It's set for 10 years. It will be renewed again in 1892, and then in 1902 renewed kind of indefinitely. Really? And another part of this Exclusion Act is it becomes difficult, if not impossible, for Chinese to naturalize. So the way that Chinese immigrants could naturalize before was they could become citizens at the lower court level. So like, different kind of city, state courts, that power is stripped away by the Exclusion Act. So it makes it difficult, again, if not impossible, for Chinese to naturalize and become citizens. So that's basically what it does. Right. It's significant because it's really kind of the beginning almost of our nationwide centralized immigration policy. And it has its roots in this very discriminatory and frankly racist act. You know, it's another way interesting that you can get around the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, I mean, it certainly had an impact on the number of Chinese who came here, without a doubt. But Chinese immigrants, they still did come to the United States, even during this, you know, era of exclusion. So if you can prove that you're a merchant, right, you can come here. So a lot of Chinese restaurant owners, a lot of Chinese laundry owners, that's a way you can get around this, coming into the United States through Mexico or even through China. Those are ways you can get around that. But yeah, the Exclusion Act specifically targeted manual laborers. And then when it's renewed again in 1892, then you're expected, if you are a Chinese national, if you were born in China and you're here, to carry papers with you at all times to prove that you are here, you know, legally.
All right. And as a follow-up, when is this rescinded?
Not until World War II,
Really?
technically. So in I want to say 1943.
Yeah.
Now I'm forgetting the exact date, but 1943 is when the Exclusion Act is officially repealed, and very pragmatic reasons. You know, China is our ally
Right.
during World War II. So it's seen as this kind of outdated, not very conducive to good relations, especially with Chinese Americans, you know, in the United States. So yeah, it sticks around for a while. And then even beyond that, it's not really until 1952 that Asian immigrants can have that path to naturalization. So yeah, the Chinese Exclusion Act is kind of the law of the land up until the 1940s.
Wow, for decades. Okay, and final question. So how was Chinese immigration and contrarily exclusion part of these broader trends of immigration in the late 19th, early 20th centuries? Obviously, immigration is a perennial question that students are going to grapple with throughout their U.S. history courses, and you know, even today, I mean, it just remains, and as you've discussed, and through today, controversial, right?
Yeah.
To say the least. And so, what would be your general conclusions about how it fits into some of these larger patterns?
So I definitely think, you know, the push and pull factors are key here. It's a really, the Chinese are a really good example to see how that works. There, you know, sometimes when we think about immigration more generally, and I would say maybe the general public, when they think about immigration at the turn of the 20th century, we kind of immediately go to there's Ellis Island and the Italians, right? And, you know, Jewish immigrants from other places. And that excludes a whole separate group who are, you know, they are part of it. So, I mean, by the time you get to the early 1900s, there's exclusion, but Chinese are coming here at right around the same time as all of these other groups. So it's not just Ellis Island, right? You got to shift also to Angel Island on the West Coast. That's certainly part of this bigger story, and it kind of takes the idea of immigration and broadens it, and also challenges a little bit this notion of the melting pot, which is a very specific progressive era invention to talk about how easy it is for Americans to get melted into what it means to be an American. You know, how true is that when you have an entire, you know, nationality and eventually race, when you get to Asian immigrants in general, excluded? So it complements, it fits into this bigger story, and adds some nuance in different ways that might not immediately be there. And then as you move toward the early 20th century and you work toward sort of the big one, the Immigration Act of 1924, it's different groups kind of take the place for the Chinese, different Asian groups. So once the Chinese are, you know, kind of dealt with the Chinese Exclusion Act, there's still going to be a need on the West Coast for, you know, laborers in agriculture. then you get Japanese immigrants who are going to come to the West Coast. And you know, the push factor there is a little bit different. Japan is kind of coordinating this effort to have Japanese immigrants seek, you know, their fortunes elsewhere and to seek out other opportunities and kind of integrate into this modern world. So Japanese are going to come and settle in California, and they're going to be agricultural laborers, but then they're going to start to become really successful in having their own farms, and they're taking risks. So they're actually planting crops that, you know, a white farmer would not have thought to have planted, or they didn't have the means or the knowledge of like irrigation. So there, I mean, again, by 19 teens, people are angry at Japanese farmers because they're developing a monopoly on the land, and they're using all of these shady business practices, and that's how they're able to get ahead. And the white farmer is getting pushed off the land. Kind of the same pattern. People on the West Coast are demanding federal action. Federal government doesn't necessarily want to do it because they don't want to make Japan angry. They don't want to jeopardize relations there. So states start to pass laws like California that say aliens ineligible for citizenship, which is very vague, but it actually at this time, it means predominantly Asians and Japanese. They are unable to own property. They can't own property. And you see these pop up even in southern states like Louisiana, and Florida, where the Japanese population is not that big at the time, but the fear that Japanese, if they get pushed from the West Coast, they're going to come settle in the South. That's enough to prompt reaction from Southerners who may not even have seen, you know, a Japanese immigrant before. In the Florida state constitution, there's still to this day the language about aliens ineligible for citizenship being unable to own property. It's still there. You can't enforce it, but it's still there today. Later on, so once the Japanese are, quote, dealt with, you're going to see Filipino immigrants or migrants, because they're colonial subjects at the time. They're going to come and kind of fill the spaces and the jobs that the Japanese once did. But by the time you get to the 1930s, we're in the Depression. So now there's that competition again, right? For the same jobs, similar to what happened back with the Chinese. So the Chinese kind of set this bad standard for how America deals with immigration, and does honestly kind of cave to the baser elements of society where they, you know, the government kind of goes along with this and doesn't necessarily push back. And by the time you get to 1924, you know, that's massively discriminatory, not just to the Chinese or even Asians, but to these, you know, Italians, Eastern Europeans. The numbers that are able to come under the Immigration Act of 24 are really low compared to people who can come from Britain or France or Germany, or even Caribbean islands that are under British control at the time. And that's partly because, you know, the government had learned that they could do this, take this kind of action. And people certainly protested against it, but the Chinese exclusion kind of sets that up, that you can target specific groups, you can pass laws, whether they're at the city, state, or federal level, and you can enforce them.
Stephanie Hinnershitz, thank you so much for joining us, joining me today in this very interesting conversation. You wove a tapestry of a very complex picture of America and American and immigration, Chinese immigration and exclusion. So we certainly thank you for weaving that tapestry for our students and teachers, and for your excellent contribution. I hope every student reads your essays, because they're really fantastic. For all the students and teachers out there, you can access our Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness textbook for free online at billofrightsinstitute.org. And we also have an excellent immigration curriculum to check out while you're at it. So again, thank you for joining us, and have a good day.
Thank you.